Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the second chapter in the book of Galatians. There's a lot of exciting and enriching material for us to cover today. There's a lot of historically significant biographical information pertaining to Paul, who is the author of this epistle, and there's also character interaction, a fascinating character interaction between him and Peter, which is both rich in drama and in doctrine. And we're just going to open by reading the 17th through 24th verses without commenting extensively from the previous chapter, just to establish the context in which the second chapter emerges. And this is Paul speaking. "Neither did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to learn from Peter and remained with him for 15 days. And I saw no other of the apostles except James, the brother of the Master. And what I write to you, see before Elohim, I do not lie. Then I went into the districts of Syria and of Cilicia, and I was not known by sight to the assemblies of Jews which were in Messiah. But they were hearing only that the one who once persecuted us now brings as good news the faith which he once ravaged. So they were esteeming Elohim in me." Now, Paul was formerly the preeminent persecutor of the embryonic Christian faith, and he did have a fierce determination and a fierce zeal and a rigorous adherence to the tradition of his ancestors, which compelled him to stamp out or eliminate he sought the wholesale destruction of what he saw as a perversion of the traditions of his ancestors. And yet he's visited on the road to Damascus, which he revisits during this time encapsulation. And the dramatic the dramatic nature of the theophany, he's visited by the Savior in resurrected form, stimulates almost a false idea, I feel, that once he got the momentum from the theophany, that he was the super evangelist that we know him as. But there's also, it's not that we read of that in the 9th chapter of Acts, and it's not until the 13th chapter where he replaces Peter as the protagonist of that book. So the moral of the lesson is good things do take time, and there's no such thing as an overnight superstar minister. Now, Paul certainly had the ingredients, but he didn't have the heart submitted to. So what Yahweh did was stimulate a conviction to channel his energy in a positive direction to fulfill the design for which he was made, and to be quite frankly, the greatest evangelist who ever lived. There's really been no one quite like Paul in all of history, and perhaps never will be again. But naturally enough, he was greeted with suspicion, however many years passed, because they all would have remembered him distinctly as their main threat to their existence. So the opening verse of the second chapter reads, "Then after 14 years I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus also." So 14 years had passed now. Paul wrote the book of Galatians during his first missionary mission. This is his earliest chronologically written epistle, believed to be dated between the years 45 and 49 AD. And the Jerusalem assembly occurred in the year 50 AD. That was a historically significant event. You can type in Corey Johnston, Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, for more on that. But Barnabas and Titus were his ministerial companions. They were Christians. Barnabas was present in the city of Damascus, not when Paul, on the road to Damascus, but when Paul entered into, the blinded Paul entered into Damascus. Barnabas treated his conversion with suspicion, where Ananias, his Christian companion, had been visited by an angel to tell him to baptize this man. And Titus is the recipient of one of the pastoral epistles, which belong in a genre which are not directed to any assembly, but to leaders of the assembly. "And I went up by revelation, and laid before them that good news which I proclaim among the Gentiles, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run, or had run in vain." So Paul's conscience of the fact that he is an above-average Christian yet his authority is not quite recognized by the apostles who were in control of the church. And there was no, as far as we know, because of the slow nature of communication in the ancient world, which had to be physically carried from one location to the next. There was no email or instant communication or anything like that. We can imagine that he did much of his preaching outside of their knowledge. And so he adopts two different approaches in reference to the state of spiritual maturity or authority that he recognizes in this verse. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Titus, unlike Timothy, was a full-blooded Greek, and the great question with the influx of the Gentile converts who were fast displacing the Jews as the Jewish by blood early Christians was, should they be circumcised or in any way held to the dictates of the Abraham Mosaic covenant. And that was a great controversy, which was ultimately quashed and quelled at the Jerusalem Council. The unanimous apostolic authority was that there were four things which they were absolutely prohibited from. But you can type in more on the discourse I alluded to earlier. But as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Messiah Yahshua, in order to enslave us. So these are scathing terms for heretic infiltrators and subversives who covertly and clandestinely overturn and subvert churches. And they do this by rejecting apostolic authority and teaching their own perverted doctrines, which has a grain of true Christianity, but is ultimately a twistification and a perversion. And the specific perversion or heretical movement was the Judaizers, and they were vanquished theologically at the Jerusalem Council. To these we did not yield in subjection, not even for an hour, so that the truth of the good news remains with you. So he's treating them in as much as they deserve. That's all he has to say to them. All it takes is an hour. These are amateur spiritual believers. But from those who were esteemed to be what they were, it makes no difference to me. Elohim shows no partiality. For those who were esteemed contributed not to me. So he's at once acknowledging that the apostles unanimously acknowledged him. They added nothing to what he had to say. He was preaching the correct message, and he was fulfilling his commission to speak to the Gentiles. And but they were esteemed. That's a reference most likely to the apostles, or at least high-ranking officers in the early church. But he's acknowledging that the equality of man, that is ultimately not a slight, but it could be interpreted as such by lesser men to the apostles, which deflates their authority to an essential spiritual equivalence of even the most ordinary Christians. But on the contrary, when they saw that the good news to the uncircumcised had been entrusted to me, even as Peter to the circumcised. So the emerging division of labor was Paul was commissioned to preach to the Gentiles and their kings, etc., in Acts 9:15, while Peter's authority remained, or jurisdiction generally remained, amongst the Jewish brethren. And that is not to suggest that Peter and Paul did not minister to Gentiles and Jews, respectively. Peter knocked down the barrier. He was the one who converted Cornelius, a Roman centurion, who is the original Christian Gentile convert. For he who worked in Peter to make him an apostle to the circumcised also worked in me for the Gentiles. So he's acknowledging that Peter, like him, is submitted to the same source. There's no friction or competition between those who are submitted and unified under the head of the assembly, which is the Messiah, and there's no trace of any selfish squabbling between them. So when James, Peter, and John, who seemed to be supports, came to know that grace that had been given to me, They gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, with purpose of we unto the Gentiles, and they unto the circumcised. So he receives the unanimous consensus from the preeminent apostles in the assembly, those being James, who was the biological brother of the Messiah, biological half-brother, who struggled to accept his divine nature in his own lifetime, but after the post-resurrection, he does become an outstanding leader of prominence in the Jerusalem assembly. And Peter and John were two of the most preeminent. They were in the inner circle. They were apostles amongst the 12. Essentially, they belonged to the inner circle, along with John's elder brother Andrew, who we read was executed by one of the Herods in Acts 12. And remember, Paul's first missionary journey doesn't occur till the 13th chapter of Acts, so that's ultimately an imaginative chronological framework you're going to have to figure out for yourself, but if you're curious, the information is there. Only that we might remember the poor, which I myself was eager to do. Now, this was a pressing situation in Jerusalem at the moment, and the Jerusalem assembly fell into grievous debt, which had to be alleviated by the other assemblies, and the charitable contributions are alluded to in the 2 Corinthians. Now, what happened is Jerusalem held all things in common and had no sense of property or money, and the fallacy of that philosophy is one, they did not arrive at the conclusion. It was not, strictly speaking, God ordained, because collectivism and socialism are contrary to the laws of God and nature. So they took it upon themselves to institute that artificially egalitarian economic system, and it placed them in ruinous debt. And when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was at fault. Now, Antioch was a city of some prominence. It was there in Acts 11:26 that they, what most Bibles translate as they first came to call themselves Christians. So that marks the distinct emergence, or the distinct conscience emergence, of a whole new faith, a whole new body of belief, and a whole new body of believers. And Peter was at fault. Now, Paul could have addressed this one of two ways. He could have written the epistle to Peter, as he was inclined to do with assemblies, to correct their doctrinal and behavioral errors, or he could have approached him face to face and given the exigencies of the situation, a face-to-face confrontation was most necessary. Some situations demand eye contact, and the written word is no substitute for a face-to-face confrontation. For before some came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself in fear of those of the circumcision. So Peter was treated the Gentiles as equal enough. Now, that was a great taboo amongst Jewish societies. They were not to share a meal with Gentiles, but Peter had no qualms about it until the Judaizers came into town, and the Judaizers thought quite differently than Peter, and Peter was conscious of the pressure that they might. So he succumbed to peer pressure, essentially. That was his character flaw, which was rooted in his hypocrisy, which is the sin Paul addresses. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led away by their hypocrisy. And the rest of the Jews means rest of the Jewish Christians. They did not, it's not a reference to wider Judaism. But the hypocrisy was contagious enough to eventually infect Barnabas, and that's probably how Paul caught wind of the controversy. But when I saw that they are not walking straight according to the truth of the good news, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live as a Gentile and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? So this is... Now, what Peter was doing was essentially inegalitarian and hierarchical in nature, if because he was succumbing to the Judaic hierarchy while implementing correctly the Christian equality before they came, and then he succumbs to their peer pressure. So it was really a failure of weakness, of weakness of mind and vulnerability to peer pressure. We Jews by nature, and not of the Gentiles, sinners, knowing that a man is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Yahshua Messiah, even we have believed in Messiah Yahshua, in order to be justified by faith in Messiah, and not by works of the law, because by works of law no flesh shall be justified. So the doctrine of justification is outlined. It explains what it is and what it isn't. Now, justification is the theological term for which we are declared innocent at the judgment, and the great question is, how does one attain that state of being? And to be justified, you cannot be justified by honoring the Mosaic law in its minutiae, because once you break one of the laws, by the entire law you are condemned. That is not to suggest that the law serves no purpose. It functioned as a schoolmaster, as Paul eventually relates the analogy outside of this chapter. But returning to justification, he knew that Peter knew that the path of justification, what it was, and having this knowledge demands that he apply it in action, and this he was not doing, because he was essentially consenting, if only covertly and inexplicably, to the Judaizer premise that Christianity plus Judaism was necessary for salvation. And if while seeking to be justified by Messiah, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Messiah then a servant of sin? Let it not be. So, accepting the atonement expunges our sins, but it doesn't absolve us from continuing to sin, and nor spare us of the consequences in the mortal realm of the exchange between humans with agency interacting with each other. So he doesn't want to cheapen the doctrine of justification or the fact thereof by excusing it to sin. Now, it is presumptuous to claim to be crucified with the Messiah. We're going to touch on that eventually, and yet belittle the blood that was spilled on your behalf by sinning deliberately and taking it upon yourselves to institute personal license. For if I rebuild what I overthrew, I establish myself a transgressor. So he's conscious of the hypocrisy, the potential for hypocrisy, and that is identified as a sin. For through Torah I died to Torah in order to live to Elohim. So the born-again experience is a semi-suicidal experience. It means death to self and all the accompanying appetites, desires, and dreams. And you have to, but the paradox is that from death to self comes life in heaven. I have been crucified with Messiah, and I no longer live, but Messiah lives in me. And that which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of Yahweh, who loved me and gave himself for me. Now there's a lot to digest for this calls for a co-crucifixion by which the sincere believer is to metaphorically and theoretically partake in the cross and nail their sins to there. Once having come to the cross, one can, if they're submitted on their knees when the cross approaches them in full-scale repentance, they can nail their sins to the cross metaphorically. And that means a death to sin, because he who was sin, though he had no sin, died for us. He became sin in order to die for sinners, so that sinners might live. And Paul has no sense of self in this new state of being, this supreme state of spiritual maturity in which the idea of self is illusion, because everything we are and everything we have and everything we claim revolves around Messiah. Ergo, our lives are not our own, but his. And the love of Yahweh was the supreme expression of the love of Yahweh, was very much the condescension, the incarnation, and the atonement ministries which were fulfilled by the Messiah perfectly. I do not put aside the grace of Elohim, for if righteousness is through Torah, then Messiah died for naught. So the entire purpose for which it was even necessary for the Messiah to die was to liberate the Jews from the bondage of the previous covenant. And of course, many Jews remain stuck on there, but that does not mean that we cannot claim the greater spiritual salvation by accepting the doctrine correctly. Now, to treat for the Messiah to die in vain, there's a lot of ways he can do that. We can stand on the assurance of righteousness through the inferior covenant or inferior dispensation, or we can accept it for what it is and not try to add anything to it. Good works are not extra credit. They are minimal obligation. And when we sin, we belittle the blood that was spilled on our behalf. So having taken the blood, which has a spiritually hygienic effect, which expunges us from the eternal consequences of sin, we owe it to ourselves not to belittle that treasure by succumbing to sin in the world in which we live. And that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.